The Elder Scrolls III: Morrowind, released in 2002, is the third game in the series I played through to the end, after Oblivion and Skyrim. Shortly before Skyrim was officially announced, I found Bethesda's forums, and it is impossible to overstate how much praise Morrowind got. Years later, it is still considered one of the greatest games of all time, and certainly the best in the series. It wasn't until I got a half-decent laptop that I gave it a go, back in the mid-2010s. And for the most part, I agree. At least as far as the rest of the series is concerned. Of the series, this game does the most right, with its interesting world, cool main story, and memorable characters. Despite any gripes I have below, the game always just felt right, in a way few others have. While Arena and Daggerfall are in its roots, it's here we really see what Elder Scrolls will be for the rest of the series, alongside Bethesda's design for the Fallout series in the near future. Start the game and you're a prisoner, and from there, you take the sensible route of just getting released. Yeah, no daring escape this time. Once you create a character, you're booted out the door, with information on a contact to meet later on. For some, I imagine this would be a bit overwhelming, and a longer tutorial could have helped. But believe me when I say, it prevents subsequent playthroughs from being tedious at the beginning. Gameplay-wise, it more or less allows you the same freedoms as Daggerfall, with some exceptions we'll go over a little later. Equip yourself right, and you can levitate and explore every nook and cranny of the tombs and caverns to your heart's content, all of which are handcrafted instead of, love-crafted this time. And like in Daggerfall, you will need some form of magic, either through spells, enchantments, or potions, even if you're dedicated muscle. But thankfully, unlike in the previous game, enchanted items are all over Morrowind. And much like the Zelda series, this game is all about exploration. How Vvardenfell is laid out is the opposite of Daggerfall's massive map, smaller and jam-packed with lore, interesting locations, and secrets to find. It hits the right balance between being big enough to fit what the game needs, and small enough to prevent traveling from feeling like a drag. Most towns are distinct as well, between the pyramid-esque city of Vivec to the dust-blasted houses of Aldruin. Later games would do a decent job of this as well, but they never quite have the same level of strange diversity that Morrowind had. Tall mushrooms carved for wizard towers, a giant crab converted into a great hall. Of the series, this was always my favorite map to explore. And there are a lot of guilds to choose from. You have the straightforward fighters, mages, thieves, and assassins, in this case the Morag Tong. But then you have the Great Houses, Tribunal, Imperial Legion, and a few others. And what works about this is they tend to overlap between the three RPG disciplines, Fighter, Mage, Stealth, and act as hybrids. House Leilu, for instance, tends to emphasize stealth, diplomacy, and its own share of fighting. So when I did a stealthy character and didn't want to join the assassins or thieves, espionage and sword fights for a ruling house was a great alternative for me. They also illustrate the attitudes of the various branches of Vvardenfell without delving into black and white morality. Leilu is diplomatic and more open to the Empire, and as a result is the wealthiest of the three. Redoran is Morrowind's flavor of patriotism and xenophobia, wanting to put Morrowind first, but also in line with conservative religious groups. And then we have Telvanni, whose know-it-all leaders care little for politics, the Empire, the Tribunal, or anything else that keeps them away from their magical experiments, amoral or otherwise. All of these factions paint a world in a way no number of cutscenes can manage. And that painting extends further into the main quest. What works about it, more than not only later games in the series, but sandboxes in general, is that a slow pace is justified. Oblivion and Skyrim have fast-paced openings that demand urgency, which makes ignoring the main quest indefinitely a touch awkward. Gates to Oblivion appearing and sudden dragon attacks are not things you just learn to live with in a short amount of time. Just ask the Doomarine. But the main villain in Morrowind, Daggerfall, is an old, well-known threat by the start of the game, in a volcano that everyone knows to stay away from. Yes, he may break out one day, despite the Tribunal's promise to keep him at bay, but there's no reason to think that will happen today, tomorrow, or even months from now. So people just carrying on with their business feels a lot less jarring, even without the Radiant AI and character schedules of later games. It also helps that if you go straight to the Blade's contact, he'll outright tell you to get a job and come back when you're ready. He understands the basics of the prophecy and is not about to throw a newbie at the greatest threat in the province. Which is fine, because going through guild quests before the main campaign is basically tradition for me. But even when you're going through these guilds, you're never truly free of the underlying threat either. Daggerfall's cult, the Sixth House, has dungeons scattered outside of the Red Mountain as well, and could be stumbled upon or part of a guild quest. And while the draw distance doesn't allow you to see the Red Mountain at all times, you are reminded of it every time you look at your map, a big black spot in the center of the island you constantly have to work around. Like Ganon's castle in Breath of the Wild, no matter where you go, its presence can be felt. Daggerfall is baked into the very bones of Morrowind, its history and its culture. Other than world building, one of the things that makes Morrowind fun is how fundamentalist the game is about abiding to its own rules. No NPCs are cardboard cutouts anymore, and every single one of them, from enemies, barkeepers, to even a living god, are bound by the rules the game sets. What I'm saying is, you could kill, rob, or otherwise affect every last one of them. I typically don't, but it's one of the things that keeps its systems consistent. Got the info you need from a slave driver? Maybe Morrowind needs one less slave driver. But murder aside, the systems allow for little loopholes that can be fun to discover. For instance, I had no idea what a Telekinesis Potion would have been good for during the first time through. But as a stealthier character, I discovered that in the absence of any physics engine, it basically means I grab and activate things from a distance. Trying to sneak past someone staring at a locked door you need to get through? Well, drink telekinesis and you can pick the lock and open it from a distance, drink some invisibility, and he is none the wiser. Yes, it is odd that the NPC didn't think to question why a door opened for no reason, but, well, rules are rules. That is just one of the many little workarounds you can do with the systems that Morrowind provides. And believe me when I say we'll be here all day if I decide to list them all. How the magic is categorized makes a bit more sense now. It is also expanded with Conjuration, allowing you to call your buddies from Oblivion to deal with problems for you. Teleportation through the Mages Guild comes at a cost now, but it's available from the moment you join. As far as freedoms go, I can't think of anything magic-wise that has been taken away since Daggerfall. Randomization has been cut down a bit since Daggerfall. Finding, say, a Daedric Daikatana is rare because they are hidden in obscure caves that are far away from any quests, not because of a roll of the dice. There are no randomized quests, which, now that I've sampled the entire series, I am two ways about. In Daggerfall, you could treat a guild like a job that you get assignments from indefinitely. You can't really do that in Morrowind. In a guild, quests dry up the second you're headmaster, so you can never just keep working. The quests themselves are a bit better constructed as a result, and the dungeons make sense now, so it's a win-some, lose-some trade. To Morrowind's credit, I never came out of the game thinking I was lacking something to do. Alchemy is a lot more interesting now. You need at least 2 ingredients of matching effect, and it's possible, if you have a third ingredient or a second matching effect, to make a potion that does multiple things. The interface for it is terrible, and this would be improved upon in Oblivion and Skyrim, but it was still fun to puzzle out, even if all of my storage was filled with ingredients I never bothered using. And of the 3 games, Morrowind offers the most effects. The only disappointment I have is that you could not put poison on your weapon. But again, that will be fixed in later games. The dialogue system is one of the more divisive aspects of the game. The game pauses and it gives you a list of topics that you have encountered so far, either through past dialogue, quests, or otherwise. Click on a subject and it may give you a hyperlink to other topics, which will in turn lead to more topics, etc., etc. It is considered unintuitive due to the wad of text it often throws you into, and though the game does have some of the more interesting NPCs, most NPCs parrot the same lines per topic word for word, with little individuality. That said, I kind of like it. The complaints are valid, but there is a deeper purpose to this mechanic. What this illustrates is the common knowledge and views of the people as a whole, rather than individual characters. Bring up something like the Red Mountain, and you'll likely be introduced to the main villain before even starting the main quests. Long before trying Blood Moon, you'll hear about how Solstheim is a terrible place. While it does not convey speech naturally, I always found it fun as both an investigative tool and a world-building aspect. Later games would save moments like those for semi-interactive cutscenes and select dialogue moments. But I love it when a game forces you to dig through the weeds via gameplay, gathering details long before they are relevant and just absorbing information organically. Divinity Original Sin 2, for instance, allows you to discover the identity of one of the major villains through a discarded note you can find, with little ceremony but for your character's reactions. During a guild line, Daggerfall can be a footnote, a presence you know you need to be aware of, yet very far away. It's a unique storytelling moment that games provide, which movies need additional filming for, and often lacking any subtlety whatsoever. Bigger budget projects would give every important moment a big cinema or cutscene to highlight it. But revelations through your own investigations is far more powerful in an interactive medium. Keep the player in control, and depending on what kind of game you're making, you don't actually need that many cutscenes. Morrowind's storyline only highlights a few moments with cinemas, and because they're so rare, they have more of an impact. And of course, there's the music. Now, I'm well aware of the accusations against Jeremy Soule in recent years, but that is not what this video is about. It should be addressed, and it has been addressed by many a writer, so we're not doing that here. The soundtrack is still fun, and one of the more interesting ones in the series. It's not the 16-bit feel of previous games, nor is it the Lord of the Rings-inspired sound of later on. It has more of a swashbuckler feel, as some of the tracks would not be out of place in a Pirates of the Caribbean movie. The combat tracks tend to sound more pulp adventure than lines of troops defending Helm's Deep. And as a fan of that kind of pulp story, I enjoyed it. My only gripe is that there's no distinction between overworld, towns, and dungeons, which is a bit of a shame. But the notes of the main theme would be heard in every Elder Scrolls game from here on in. Like the gameplay and the map, the music of the series would find its benchmark in Morrowind. This is also the first Elder Scrolls game with proper expansions. Battlespire was supposed to be one for Daggerfall, but it became its own title instead. A lot of what I love about vanilla Morrowind is in both Tribunal and Blood Moon, so I'll try not to digress too much. But what I love about expansions like these, specifically, is that they are effectively sequels for the character you created. See, one advantage that superhero sequels have is that no time is required for the origin story, allowing more time for the action. You're not just some scrub released from prison who can't even hit a scrib to save his own life. You're the hero of Morrowind, fresh from Red Mountain, whom the Dark Brotherhood decide to mess with, to their downfall. And after all that time leveling up your character to defeat Daggerfall, it's good to have more room to play around with them. A lot of games have you at max level only a few moments before the end of the game. In most Elder Scrolls games, you have whole new areas to explore after the fact. It's one of the reasons why I think mission pack sequels have more value than they're often given credit for. We're not focusing on the modding community today, but it bears mentioning at the very least. It's one of the reasons Morrowind, even with the release of Oblivion and Skyrim, has remained alive for nearly 2 decades. Like Doom before it, it's become its own environment filled with overhauls, new areas, and several other additions. Again, not the subject of today, since the video has to end at some point, but it's become such a vital part of Morrowind's fanbase that ignoring it would miss why it has lasted so long. And now we've reached the foible of the series, that for every great thing it accomplishes, it takes some steps back. Now, none of these are deal breakers, but I do feel some of these things need to be addressed. Overall, I feel that some parts of the systems are a bit of a downgrade from Daggerfall. Having played each game in the series, I've come to the conclusion that the bonus attribute system just does not work. On paper, it makes sense. You exercise the muscles you use. But assigning each skill to one specific attribute comes with weird quirks. Destruction magic, for instance, is tied to willpower and will not affect intelligence, which is the only attribute that affects your magic pool. Hand-to-hand is governed by speed, which makes zero sense as, unlike in Daggerfall, speed is not a factor in delivering blows. Agility is necessary for all weapons to hit, but the only weapon that affects it is marksman. Now, despite this, it is also too easy to exploit. Maxing out every attribute and skill in this game is not difficult if you know where the trainers are, and money stops being an issue after a while. And say you want to try staying completely in character and stick to your class. Well, there are other little downgrades as well, particularly for a fighter class. You can't climb, nor can you break down doors or chests with your weapon, taking away avenues you would have had in the past. And there are quests where spamming trainers is necessary. There's a point in Blood Moon where you specifically have to go into a hand-to-hand fight with a Nord in order to get him to leave. My character had about as much expertise in hand-to-hand as he did with quantum physics, so blowing a lot of money on a trainer was the best option. By that point, you have more than enough cash to max it out, and there are no limits to how many times you can visit one, so there's really no reason to spend time punching mudcrabs or something. Later Fighters Guild quests require you to taunt people into fighting, which requires persuasion and personality, or else you will be arrested. And those are two things that the guild does not favor, nor were you likely thinking about them during character creation. From there, your only options are save scumming or visiting a trainer. While most quests are straightforward enough, some even having multiple avenues, the game occasionally comes to a grinding halt because you're suddenly required to use that one skill that you never gave any thought toward. All of these problems point to a game that requires metagaming a little too often. And as a result, your class and the character you had in mind takes a bit of a backseat. For many players, it is too tempting to just max everything out, making every playthrough feel the same at the end, regardless of your class choice at the beginning. The character creation ditches the dice roll for attributes, and I do not see that as a bad thing necessarily, but you no longer have the advantage-disadvantage categories, limiting your customization considerably. Instead, you have birth signs, some of which are completely pointless. The warrior sign has lasting effects because it means more accuracy for your attacks at all times. But the steed, which gives plus 25 to speed, becomes trivial if you know what you're doing. You're never not leveling up your speed either, whether through athletics or acrobatics. The plus 25 doesn't let it go over the max 100 either. The fundamental differences between, say, Solaris and Eliwood of Daggerfall just cannot be duplicated here to any meaningful level. With little restraints and the game demanding you to go beyond your intended class, the idea of builds and distinct characterization via abilities becomes a very thin veil that is easily torn. While magical effects have been expanded, there are things I miss from the older games. Personally, I liked how the power of any given spell increased with your level in Arena and Daggerfall. It was a task of balancing cost and effectiveness, and you weren't filled to the brim with healing spells of varying degrees that you no longer use. After a while in Morrowind, and let's be fair, Oblivion, most spells become completely useless. Also, I dislike how spells may or may not be cast at all due to a dice roll. In Daggerfall, that only happened in specific effects like Cure Disease, and because of how spell casting worked, you could address the chance directly during spell making. Otherwise, it was just the enemy's defensive roll deflecting the spell. In Morrowind, you need your skill high enough just to reliably cast, making magic a far less reliable option at lower levels. For those saying that ditching this in Oblivion or Skyrim is dumbing down, quote-unquote, I don't see how an arbitrary roll just to cast a basic spell makes it deeper. Harder, for sure, but not for the right reasons. Dice rolls for melee combat I'll buy, since it's your attack versus the enemy's defenses. And the reason I'm ragging on this is that it comes up a lot when comparing Morrowind to other games, like this is somehow the root problem of the magic of Oblivion and Skyrim. They are letdowns between having less effects and overall variety, but not because they removed an arbitrary wall just to cast a spell. And whenever someone tears into the later games for this specific reason, it reeks of back-in-my-day snobbery, not as something sensible.
All will suffer as I have suffered.
Morrowind is the only game in the series that does it this way, so removing that is closer to a return to form rather than a disgrace of the franchise. That said, let's move on to the melee combat. Now, combine all of Morrowind's relevant skills together, and there are a lot of things you can do with it, between sneak attacks, magic effects, and other factors. So, enemy encounters are far from boring, and finding a magic weapon can be very cathartic, especially if you've been having a rough go at the beginning of the game. But the melee combat alone has a lot to be desired. Now, for this part, I will be concentrating on straight melee combat. No magic, no enchantments, just the options that a single PC with a sword in his hand. Ultimately, it's my least favorite of the series. And no, it's not because of dice rolls. Daggerfall had that, and I liked it just fine. So did Pillars of Eternity, so did Divinity Original Sin 1 and 2, and countless other RPGs. Nor is the problem having to adjust to how the stamina works in Morrowind, as that stops being a meaningful factor after a while. It is a factor, don't get me wrong, but once you adjust to it, it's seldom really on your mind. Your options are hit the enemy or hit them harder. And that's basically it. There are different ways of swinging at different attack powers, but with no difference in hit percentage, there's no reason not to use the hardest hitting swing at the highest damage potential. Yes, there are a lot of numbers going into each swing and defense. Yes, you can wear a shield that might occasionally stop an attack once in a blue moon. Yes, there's a chance of the enemy being thrown off his stride or even knocked down as a result of landing a hit. But you can't specifically provoke those moments. You can't, say, decide to knock a specific enemy over in order to temporarily take him out of the fight while focusing on another opponent. There's practically no defensive game at your command, with strafing doing little more than prolonging the fight, rather than turning the tide. Oblivion brought back the way that enemies are knocked away from every landed hit. While it looks a little silly, that small difference can make use of the environment between traps and keeping enemies in tunnels. You're eventually able to disarm the opponent and knock him onto the ground as well. Skyrim also offers a fair number of maneuvers with the right placement of perk points. As a melee combatant, you can think your way through a tough fight in either game. The key word here is options, and on the fly, Morrowind gives you very little. For all the dice rolls that go on in the swing of a sword, there isn't much for a melee combatant to do. This is a product of its time, with, say, Baldur's Gate giving vanilla fighters the ability to attack and nothing else. And doing the other swings is a bit awkward, requiring you to move a specific way. Daggerfall, while it does lock the camera, allows you to swing in any way regardless of movement. In comparison, Morrowind is more cumbersome. Where this becomes a problem is when the game tries to crank up the difficulty. Like most Elder Scrolls games, Morrowind starts hard but ends with you wiping the floor with most enemies. But then we get to enemies like Hircine's werewolves, specifically during the last dungeon of Blood Moon. After hours of swinging your sword a couple of times to get through most encounters, these enemies can spot a master itself from miles away and tear apart the most seasoned fighter. And from there, all you can do is swing and pray. It turns into a stat battle, not something I would call strategic. Thankfully, there are plenty of potions and magic items to get you through, so you're not completely screwed. But having more consistent, maneuver-based melee combat would have made the difficulty curve a bit smoother. Don't get me wrong, Daggerfall is also basic in its combat, but even that had more to work with. Morrowind, melee combat-wise, took a couple of steps back and ends up being mechanically lacking. There are other gripes I could go over. Tribunal has some dips in the storyline, but that's a basic consensus among fans already. It also tries to introduce set pieces like Almalexia's evil speech, which just isn't as engaging as keeping you in control. The animation is bad, especially compared to 2001's lineup of games. I mean, seriously, look at this. The persuasion mechanic isn't great, but I'm at a loss as to how it can be improved in a sandbox. I mean, looking at how the next two games do it, so is Bethesda. And this is also the game that introduced armor skills, which only gets weirder and further out of balance as the series progresses. But why does Morrowind work? The combat animations and even dips in the plot never destroyed the game for me. I thought about this across the entire series, and I realized what brings things together for me. Satisfaction in this game and Daggerfall comes from knowing what's under the hood and how the character had grown. It may not be a good-looking car, but you love the way it runs and everything it can do. All of its parts, from combat to lockpicking to stealth and magic, just click right in a way that few games ever accomplish. When I first defeated Daggerfall, I did what the game required, destroying the source of his power, and then took out Goldbrand. In a few swings and a lucky block with my shield, he had fallen. It was over in seconds. I barely survived, but it was enough. The battle was short because that was simply how our hero dealt with his adversaries.
Skill again, skill wrong.
And the right choice of equipment. It made me appreciate every attribute, skill, and other small factor that went into his ability. That is what I mean by a good engine under the hood. Despite what I said about his melee combat, I understand that it's not designed to have drawn-out fights. It was built to be fast and dangerous, and that quality extends to all damage types, like archery and magic. Later games, as we will go over, will be less about tweaking things from within and more about adding more Lego pieces on top of more player skill-based gameplay. This is not necessarily a bad choice depending on how you handle it, but I can see where a lot of old fans would prefer this kind of system. I still feel that Daggerfall handled all the overall systems better, but Morrowind does everything else so well that it is easy to forgive. Vardenfell and its expansion areas are still an absolute joy to explore for their uniqueness alone, and both times I played through it, it had me looking forward to stepping into the Red Mountain. And of course, it's fun finding new loopholes and ways to exploit them. It's the kind of game that has me smiling at every new thing I discover, and I hope to discover more in the future. Next time, we look at Oblivion, its ups and its downs.